All right, and we are back with another episode of Content Minded. Episode 66? Yeah, 66. Last episode, I wanted, I wish it got more views, but I guess, I don't know. I cast pearls before swine. It was really a big deep dive into the life and the artwork of Nikolai Rorish. How he truly is, I think, an artist and a man of history and a man of power. But I don't know, hopefully you watch that episode as well. And as I always say, to support the show, Patreon and Substack, it's only $5 a month, I mean, come on. If only like a fraction of you contributed, I wouldn't have to worry about, well, I don't know, I've been told that there may be an art opportunity soon, but, well, we'll see what happens. Because a lot of it's predicated on a new cultural moment that I think is going to form. And up until now, it's been like the stuff that I've written about since 2016. It's been a lot of memes and a lot of talk about making art and having a counterculture, but something that's not built upon a sort of level of contrarian sand, which I think is harmful. And there are certain people that, fit the bill without getting too infighty. But anyways, I do what I can, And I think that this is why I really like the Cole Report. And for those of you who have just been hearing this, I'm going to release the teasers on YouTube. But the Cole Report is hopefully every week. I'll try to keep it from an hour to an hour and a half, which basically goes through all of the discourse. And it's more of like being ranty and talking about politics because I wanted to keep content minded apart from having guests, which I have recorded 3 episodes with guests, by the way. And all of them are quite amazing. And one of them will be I think, really spicy. But I got to play my cards right with that one. And the stuff that me and Kathrine are doing in the computer room is quite fascinating as well. We have another episode that's quite spicy. But we have a lot of great stuff planned for that. And of course, Digital Archipelago, we always are doing great stuff. But I wanted the Cole Report. It's going to be available it's 4 episodes so far, and it's only available in full to subscribers. But that's where I can cut loose and rant, because here on Content Minded, I wanted to keep the original mission of having things more highbrow and having things be, a bit more sophisticated. Whether it's with philosophy and, of course, art and culture and art criticism and guests. And of course, whenever we venture into politics on Content Minded, it will be more theoretical and more, more historical, theoretical, sociological, rather than just like the hot take of the day. Although the hot take of the day inevitably bleeds into it. So this is one of those episodes that I wanted to do that is specifically focused on politics. I wanted to revisit a concept that I think some people may consider outdated in the political horizons of nowadays, especially on, what would you call it, the dissident sphere, the E-right. I call it the E-right. But a term I've been using lately, and a lot of people have different terms for what exactly is the conglomeration of things that we're going against. There's that spicy term, which I can't say on YouTube. There's the GAE. There's, I believe Tucker said recently, which was before only basically an internet term, which in an interview, which is, let's see, how can I say it? LGBT by POC communism. Yeah, I'll go with that one. There's another term too. Anyways, let's talk about that. But people call it the cathedral. And then, of course, people accuse Moldbug, which, I mean, there's some validity to. I'm not the biggest fan of... I don't know, I have mixed opinions about Moldbug. There's a lot of things Moldbug believes in and does that I don't exactly approve of. I recently found out that his wife follows me on Twitter. So I gotta, I don't know. I feel like if someone is following me, I feel like this obligation to not be too confrontational. You know what I mean? It is what it is. And of course, people recently, I had this exchange on Twitter about why don't you focus on Canadian politics? And I mean, some of it is because it's like, well, if you go out of your way, then it gets a lot of attention on you, and you know how the way the average leaf lib is crazy. So that's partially true. But I think that one day I will bring on another fellow leaf who is well versed in the political history of Canada to bring on and talk about various issues of like what the potentiality for a newer iteration of the Canadian political and socio-political and cultural landscape could potentially be, right? And of course, George Grant immediately comes to mind. But, that's a future stream. What I wanted to talk about is a term that was popular somewhat in the early 2000s and has recently not been heard of for a very long time, because I think that the literature on it is sparse. It comes from a few people and a few think tanks, like the Hudson Institute. Was it Hudson Institute? Yes. I hope I'm not misquoting. Is it? Yeah. Because I think that it fell out of favor, and a lot of neocons back in the day used this term, but I think it could be wrestled away from the neocons. And of course, a lot of conspiracy, Alex Jones types, the conspiracy movement, was acquainted with this term because this is where the origins of globalism versus nationalism, or globalism versus liberty, or globalism versus whatever came from. And it has its origins in other places like the John Birch Society, which I'll get into. But I wanted to talk about, as the title of this stream, Transnational Progressivism, or Tronsism, revisited, Tronzy. And I've been using the term because I like to meme things. It's like the stock photo thing, which I will get into one day. But I really like to meme terms, because some things that I've said, they go on to be used by other people, believe it or not. Even though I'm relatively not that big. But like neoliberal kitsch. Yes, I know the book. I know. I have to get back to my editor if he does his job in a timely manner. But anyways, that's besides the point. Don't worry about it, okay? Just don't worry about it. Anyways, my point being is that I wanted to talk about the history and the development of the idea and the potential to bring back the term transnational progressivism. Something that is supremely optical, yet can mean many different things to many different people, and I think can summarize things that are, in a way, better than the terms like cathedral or GAE or LGBT by POC communism, although I think that's a pretty good term, or that other term which I can't mention for obvious reasons, that are very popular in like certain circles in the online right. I can't mention it. Don't worry about it. So I think that transnational progressivism, it has its problems, though, and it's something that I want to address, is that it has a problem of the origins and who deploys it. Because, of course, a person who I consider to be the lowest of the low was someone who did use the term originally, which is John Bolton. But then, of course, John Bolton, during the Obama years, made, I would think, less of a dramatic turn, but still a turn nevertheless, towards the neocon to what did Max Blumenthal call in his book, A Management of Savageries, what did he call it? Humanitarian interventionism under Obama. People like Jennifer Rubin, David Frum, Bill Kristol, I'm sure there's other ones. There's like a bunch, Max Boot, like Michael Corrin. There's a bunch of other ones. There's a bunch of other ones where the neocons transition towards basically just being liberals, being neoliberals, being what I would call transnational progressivists. And they really embody the spirit of it. And I think that even though these categories can seem, as I'm going to read these essays that talk about Tronzy, even though they seem quite antiquated and boomerish, I think that there's a lot of truths that can be spoken. It's, boomer conservatives can also speak a level of truth that I think is often ignored. And I think that a lot of people do have, and me included, have this like knee-jerk reaction to boomerism, because boomers generally have ruined a lot of things. And they generally did leave us millennials and Gen X, some Gen Xers, but mostly millennials and Gen Z in the dust. And we're going to have to pick up the pieces in a new world when they go, which I think is both terrifying but also can be exciting in some ways. And, as much as I have a lot of complicated thoughts and criticisms about J.D. Vance, a lot of people were saying this, that now finally a millennial can be potentially in a position of power. But as I've said today in this thread, at the time of this recording, I think that people underestimate the degree to which Kamala Harris, if she is the nominee, can really seriously complicate things for Donald Trump. But I'm going to save that for Digital Archipelago. I wanted to get more into the theoretical political framework of what Tronzy or Transnational Progressivism is. So this is an essay I came across an excerpt of a long time ago, very, very long time ago, on the Graham Hancock forums. I know Graham, he doesn't have, he's complicated. There's some opinions he has that are not exactly based or whatever. But I remember on the Graham Hancock forum, someone linked to this Tom Kratman essay. Kratman? How do you say that? Kratman. It's an afterword for his book Yellow Eyes. And he was, I believe he was a special forces operator or something. And he wrote a bunch of books. And a lot of them have to do with the military. And I think he was in the special forces. Sorry, it was co-authored by Tom Kratman. It's part of the John Ringo series. And Tom Kratman, American military science fiction author and retired United States Army officer who works as published by Bean Books. Kratman's novels include the Desert Called Peace series, which has been praised for its action sequence and attention to philosophy of war. He authored 3 novels with John Ringo in the Legacy of Aldonada series. Kratman's work often reflected right-wing political perspectives, and some have been seen deliberately crafted to offend left-wing sensibilities. So yeah, he is a based boomer, and enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1974. So just after the Vietnam War. He went on to serve both in the invasion of Panama and the Gulf War. Left active service for law school in 1982, graduated in 1995. He just has a website. I wonder, he should be on Twitter. That should be quite interesting. But then he also co-authored by ex-soldier and publisher Jim Bain, who recruited a batch of younger, like-minded authors for similar backgrounds. And he was, I believe he was also popular with the conspiracy movement, or whatever you want to call it, like the conglomeration of alternative media, centered around, not exactly like Alex Jones, but, there was a lot of that stuff. A lot of ex-military people of an older generation, they really did fill the ranks in alternative media. But of course, a lot of, if you go to Mill Twitter now, a lot of ex-army people are leftoids for some reason. I wonder if that's after multiple decades of trying to purge the military of right-wing forces. Well, Mark Stein discussed the novel's political aspect at length and also described it as a brisk page-turner full of startlingly twists and bad acts. In the series A Desert Called Peace, the hero battles a worldwide caliphate, the second novel in the series, Carnifex, which is a great band, by the way, was praised by Publisher Weekly for its action sequences characterized with attention to philosophy of war. Then the Lotus Eaters placed number 8 on Wall Street Journal bestsellers list in the hardcover science fiction category. So it's like, basic Space Marine stuff. But anyways, yeah, Tom Kratman is a base boomer, and he talks about in this afterword, which is really an essay to the book he wrote with John Ringo, about transnational progressivism. So they both served, both John and Tom have served in the Republic of Panama. John for some weeks while attending the jungle school at Fort Sherman. Tom for 4.5 years with 4th Battalion, 10th Infantry as a sergeant, and 3rd Battalion, 5th Infantry as a lieutenant. Tom says the place where the happiest in his life is home. Then my home is Fort William B. Davis, Panama's Canal Zone, with 4th of the 10th Infantry from 1977 to 1978. Then they talk more about Panama. this doesn't appear to be until you look at the particulars. So he's talking about in 1989, Operation Just Cause, the United States launched a sudden and surprise attack on the existing Panama defense forces and did crush those forces in about a day, picking off holdovers in the next 3 or 4 days. This would not appear to be a great recommendation. I talked about the Panama invasion in my little-known obituary to Colin Powell, which I remember someone said to me that it was one of the best pieces of writing I've ever done. I don't know why, but like if you go to my Substack, it's there. So maybe I'll link it. But I nobody like really paid attention to that one when Colin Powell passed away. I think it was a pretty good piece of writing. I did talk about the Panama invasion. That it doesn't appear until you look into the particulars. We hit them in the night. We have an overwhelming technological advantage. We hit them with little or no tactical warning. We hit them with greater and in places overwhelming numbers and overwhelming firepower. Even though the use of the firepower was somewhat restrained, furthermore, we had hit them with complete air supremacy and used that air supremacy to deliver over and above the rather large forces we had in Panama already, 3 of the best trained, most lethal infantry battalions in the world, especially at that time, right? That was like peak. I mean, you could say that Iraq and Afghanistan was a supreme buildup of like Gen Xers and older millennials, and the U.S. military currently is in a pretty sad state. But anyways, the 3rd Battalions of the 75th Infantry, Ranger, Airborne, more forces followed on later as well. The wonder is not that we took them down in a day, but that they were able to hang on for that long. Indeed, if there were any wonder in the story, is that even when abandoned by some, one remarkably loathsome and cowardly wretch in particular, West Point, class of 1980, of their U.S.-trained officers, the others held on and fought. Then he goes on to talk more about Panama. There were more Texan prisoners taken at the Alamo. The wonder is, despite all the disadvantages, the PDF managed to inflict about 3 casualties on us for every 4 that they took. Do we mention that some young Panamanian kids with almost no time in uniform kicked the bejesus out of the U.S. Navy SEAL team? So yes, they are tough and brave people, well within the Western military tradition, and properly armed and trained they can fight. Of course, the Western military tradition outside of the US and UK isn't what it used to be. Oh, and formations are still there, some of them. The weapons are, if anything, better than ever. Even the men and women, too, of course, still have much of what made the West great inside of them. And this is where we get to the meat of the essay. Unfortunately, the West itself has largely fallen under control of civilizational Dr. Kevorkians. Some call them Transies, or Transy, is short for Transnational Progressivism or Transnational Progressives. For a more complete account of their program, look up John O'Sullivan's Gulliver's Travels, or some of what Steve Dembest had written on the subject. Steve Dembest, I think he was a European blogger. He died a while ago. He was like one of the first like reactionary bloggers. I remember I could never find the archive. I mean, I probably could translate some of his works, but it's hard to find his stuff. Stephen Dembeste, I remember the only link I came across was a link by Matty Iglesias in The Atlanticist, calling him like one of the most fringo, insane bloggers. So I'd like if someone could link me, if someone knows about Stephen Dembeste's work, if someone could link me to his stuff. You might, dear reader, also look at John Fonte's Ideological War Within the West, and we will read the essay from John Fonte. Lastly, for purposes of this little essay, look up Lee Harris's The Intellectual Origins of America Bashing. These should give you a good ground in Transism, its motives, goals, and operating techniques. All can be found online. For now, suffice to say that Transism is a successor ideology to failed and discredited Marxist-Leninism. Many of the most prominent Transies are in fact, quote, former members of various communist parties, especially European communist parties. These have taken the failure of the Soviet Union personally and hard, and brother, are they bitter about it. Now, as we all know, the famous Hegelian Marxist academic and truly one of the foremost scholars in Hegel in the world at the time, Alexander Kochev, then went on to be a main architect of the European Union, if we recall. So then Kratman says, that's right, boys and girls, pull up a chair, grab a stool, cop a squat, light him if you got him, if not, burn him off Ringo, Krat's fresh out. One of the difficult things about analyzing Transies and their work is that they are not a conspiracy. What they are is a consensus. Don't be contemptuous. Civilization is nothing more than a consensus. So is barbarism. Moreover, the Transies are a fairly cohesive consensus, especially on certain ultimate core issues. Nevertheless, if you are looking for absolute logical consistency on the part of the Transies, you will search in vain. On the other hand, at the highest level, the ultimate Transi goal, there is a complete agreement. They want an end to national sovereignty, and they want global governance by an unelected, self-chosen elite. Much of what they say and do will make no sense, even in Transi terms, unless that is borne in mind. Below that ultimate level, one cannot expect tactical, logical consistency. Things are neither good nor bad, true nor false, except insofar as they support the ultimate Transi goal. For example, if one were to ask a Transi, and especially a female and feminist one, about the propriety of men having any say over women's rights to a certain medical procedure, the Transi will probably be scandalized. After all, men don't even have babies. They know nothing about the subject from the inside, so to speak. Why should they have any say? Nevertheless, that same Transi, if asked whether international lawyers and judges and humanitarian activists, non-governmental organizations, or NGOs should have the final say in the laws of war, would certainly approve. That is true despite the fact that the next lawyer, judge, or NGO that understands as much about war as a man understands about childbirth will likely be the first. Why do we say they know nothing about the subject? By their works shall you know them. The International Criminal Court is, after the UN and the European Union, the next most significant Transi project, Kyoto being dead on arrival, and arguably the most significant with regard to the laws of war. A major, if a bare one, of the world's sovereign states have signed on to it, whether about half have ratified it or not. The ICC claims jurisdiction over all of the crimes mentioned in its founding statute, irrespective of who committed them, where they committed them, or whether the crimes are actually criminal under the traditional and customary laws of war. This is called universal jurisdiction. Universal jurisdiction as a concept has a number of flaws. Among these are that it has zero valid legal procedures behind it. Zero precedents. Zero precedents, Transies will cite at least two precedences. One of this is the jurisdiction exercised from time immemorial by any sovereign power over pirates at sea when any were caught. The other is Nuremberg. These are flawed. In the cases of Nuremberg, the jurisdiction exercised was not universal, but national jurisdiction of the coalition of the victors over a Germany whose sovereignty had been temporarily extinguished by crushing defeat in war. Well, yeah, I wonder, would any boomer-con say that nowadays? This came from, the early 2000s. When was this book published? Let me look it up. So, yeah, it was published the time of the blog post, or the forum post in the Graham Hancock forums, was published in 2007. There was another edition published in 2009. So, this is mid-2000s stuff, right? The piracy precedence was applied to modern notions of universal jurisdiction, doesn't stand close to scrutiny any better. The Transi claims that universal jurisdiction was exercised over piracy because piracy was, in its conduct and effect, so ghastly. This is wrong on both counts. In the first place, pirates were not necessarily subject to universal jurisdiction, except insofar as they were caught where national jurisdictions did not run. Typically at sea, in other words. Moreover, alongside piracy there existed privateering. In their conduct, the two are often enough indistinguishable. In other words, however ghastly privateering may have been, and the former residents of Portobello and Panama City could have told one it could be ghastly indeed. It was still not subject to universal jurisdiction. No matter the piracy was not worse than privateering. It was so subjective. The difference was the sovereign powers. Nation-states, in other words, exercised sovereign jurisdiction over privateers, were responsible for their actions, and punished them at need, while they did not and could not with pirates. It was the lack of sovereign jurisdiction both as to their persons and to the locus of their crimes that left pirates open to universal jurisdiction, and not any supposed ghastliness of those crimes. So you see right here where the problem lies. You see that this is, I know this is ancient, boomer con or conspiracy movement stuff, but it's nevertheless, it's true. So the ICC universal jurisdiction suffers other flaws. Recall, dear reader, the lack of Transi logic consistency and the questions posed above about that medical procedure in the law of war. Anti-imperialism is another Transy tactical cause, and we all know about that. About, especially nowadays, right? About Russia and imperialism and, yeah, but anyways. But what is imperialism beyond one or several states or people using force or color of law to make rules for another or other states of people? Again, that's another, like, progressive bugaboo about imperialism and the settler colonialism and so forth. And what is the ICC using all the staggering moral and military power of? Oh, Fiji, France, West Efistan, or I remember Mark Stein used to say, who gives a stand? But the attempt at enforcing rules made by one group of states upon others, it's imperialism, in other words. Of course, imperialism in the service of a higher cause, the raising of unelected self-styled global elites to power, for example, is praiseworthy in Transy terms. Nothing deterred the Transies claim that Transy courts, to include national Transy courts like those of Spain or those of Brussels, have universal jurisdiction. And why? Because they hate national sovereignty. It cramps their style. It interferes with their program. It's aesthetically unappealing. Their goal is the destruction of the national sovereignty. The right of a people to democratically make their own laws, to govern themselves, is anathema to Transy goals and dreams. When they say global governance, boys and girls, they mean it. They really intend the unelected bureaucrats and judges and self-selected elites ought to be able to tell you what to do, how to live, how to pay taxes, what rights you are not entitled to. Sovereignty stands in their way. The ultimate expression of sovereignty is a nation's and a people's armed forces. No army, no ability to defend oneself and one's laws or way of life. No sovereignty. We know this, says the Transy, but we can't control a nation's armed forces if we can't punish the soldiers, and especially the officers and a national refuge, to stand up and defend themselves. Nations that refuses to stand up and defend themselves. No nation which permits a foreign court to exercise jurisdiction over its military can any longer be said to own that military. Instead, the military will be owned by the courts able to punish leaders. Onward into the future, comrades. Let them punish your soldiers, and the soldiers can no longer be counted upon to defend the nation. Nor would you deserve being defeated by your own soldiers. Let them punish the soldiers, and there is no principal distinction to prevent them punishing the president, the legislature, even the Supreme Court, for who would defeat the president, legislature, and courts once the same has let down their soldiers. Let them punish your soldiers, and you deserve what you get. And to lose what you will lose. And while currently, so let me take a break from reading. So currently, I believe Boris Johnson wants to sell Donald Trump on the idea that he has to support Ukraine. Because if he has to he has to support Ukraine, he has to give Zelensky whatever he wants, because they're going to create a sort of universal EU military. And that Ukraine will be a EU military base, it will no longer be a nation. It will be like this militarized state that will protect the defenses of all of European nations, and the Americans don't have to foot the bill for Europe's defense costs. Although who are they defending from? Who are they? But see, here's the problem. And this came up recently with this video of some idiot tourist, which I'll talk about in Cole Report. But who are they defending Europe from? The Second World War and the Cold War, okay, I can understand, right? But nowadays, unless you are a total out to lunch media brain Ukraine stan that believes that Russia's going to go for Paris and they're going to go for the Sudetenland or whatever, I'm sorry, there's who are they defending Europe from? China? Maybe one day, but who knows? But the point being is that if you create this universal militaristic state that's going to defend all of Europe from Russia, it's just first of all, it's basically proving Putin's point about the EU and about the EU bureaucrats and about the Americans. But second of all, it's a ridiculous idea. And when you really think about it, those militaries in the EU, they don't really have any sovereignty, do they? Because they have volunteered a lot of their resources, some nations half of their military resources, then those military munitions and resources, and men also, by the way, can get blown up by Russian Lancet drones or by Iskander missiles. So, it is what it is. And this is exactly, and so when you look at the subjugated vassal state of Europe today, this is exactly what he's talking about here, what Tom Kratman's talking about. But furthermore, okay, so I understand, let's read a bit more and then I'll have some criticisms. It would be one thing if the ICC were something more than a misguided exercise in legalistic transy mutual onanism, if it could, in other words, be effective in limiting the horrors of war. It cannot be effective, ever. This is because of the very nature of war itself. There is nothing a court can do that, in terms of punishment that deters, even begins to approach the horror men inflict on each other in war routinely. In the course of normal and legal operations, there is nothing any court can do that can ever hope to catch the interests of tired men, hungry men, men fighting for victory, for their lives, and for their nations. No sensible court would ever try. There is some conduct which cannot be deterred. When life is at stake, the law recognizes no trespassing signs. When the choice is between picking pockets at a mass hanging of pickpockets and risking the noose or facing slow starvation, well, at least the rope is fairly quick. Similarly, when the choice on the battlefield is life, when power has some uncertain court distant in time, both in time and space, to deter anything, the simple answer is has none. When trivial power has the law with its trivial possible punishment, to deter the conduct that might save soldiers' lives, their comrades and their countries in the here and now. Yes, we can see that however imperfectly the customary laws of war have often worked, and even without any such body as the ICC and without Spain's recent disgusting, illegal, morally putrescent attempt at exercising sovereignty over American soldiers, it has worked imperfectly, to be sure, yet it has not worked often enough. Indeed, within Western war, it has worked more often than not. Where the law of war has worked to mitigate the horror and protect innocent life, they have by and large done so when the combatants were of the same culture, shared the same values, and had what we might like to think of as basic decency. Now, like in the Ukraine war, right? Relatively, for such a huge scale modern war, yes, civilians have perished. I'm not denying that. But in terms of the degree to which civilians have been ghosted, not a lot of civilian casualties relative to that other conflict going on in the Middle East with the favorite ally of the U.S., where most of them are civilians. So in relative numbers and scale of that war in Ukraine, because, I mean, yes, a lot of the soldiers on both sides have done unspeakable things. A lot of especially ideologically driven battalions have done unspeakable things. But in terms of civilians, relatively few have perished. And that's a testament to what he's saying. That when you engage in a war where you have a similar culture, you have a similar understanding, you are in uniform. Remember, that uniform comes with a level of honor and prestige that non-uniform combatants simply do not possess. That's what he's saying. That there is still a form of honorableness in war. So then he says, where the laws of war have worked to mitigate, so yeah, that's rarely been quite enough. It needed a little something else, some other reason to follow the rules. The other reason was the threat or fear of reprisals. Transies hate reprisals, which are war crimes in themselves, but war crimes which become legal in order to punish the enemy who violate the law of war, deter him from violating itself, and remove the advantages which accrue from such violations. The Transies don't hate reprisals merely because they're ugly, cause suffering of innocents, etc., though they hate them for those reasons too. No, Transies hate reprisals because reprisals work to enforce the law of war and their own silly courts fail. Reprisals work, you're kidding me, right? Wrong. Why wasn't poisonous gas used in the Second World War? The threat of reprisal. What happened when in 1944, the Germans threatened to execute some numbers of French resistance fighters, and the French resistance, which was held by many German prisoners, answered, "We will redact one for one." The French prisoners held by the Germans were left unharmed. Why didn't the Southern Confederacy during the American... And no, here's a red pill right now. Why didn't the Southern Confederacy during the American Civil War execute white officers of black regiments as they had passed a law to do so, because the Union credibly threatened to hang a white Southern officer for every man of theirs so mistreated. Why didn't the United States or South Vietnam execute generally Viet Cong guerrillas who had gravely violated the laws of war with the course of the insurgency then? Because the North Vietnamese had prisoners against whom they would have reprised had we or the Southern Vietnamese done so. Reprisals work, courts and statutes do not. The law of war, because of the nature of war, must be self-enforcing through reprisals, because, of course, war is a chaotic thing. At the end of the day, war entails a degree of chaos. Nothing else can work, and by any attempt to do away with reprisals is an indirect attack on us and undermining the law of war. But then again, the law of war and mitigating its horrors are not really what the Transies are about. Undermining national sovereignty, replacing sovereign nations with themselves, that's what they're about. They aren't about eliminating war horrors. Oh, John, oh, Tom, say it ain't so. It's so, and recall that we mentioned that Transism is a successor philosophy to Marxist-Leninism. It should come as no great surprise, then, that one of the key pieces of Transi legislation on the law of war should have been sponsored and forced into existence by, wait for it, the Soviet Union. This key piece of Transi legislation on the law of war was Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Convention. The protocol itself was shoved through by the Soviets at the time, when it looked like People's Revolutionary War, guerrilla war, communist insurgency would continue to be a powerful weapon to advance the cause of communism. The United States had never ratified it, and pray to God it never shall. The Russians, who forced through it, never paid it at the slightest attention, and witnessed by their conduct in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989, and more recently in Chechnya. Well, yeah, I would say that the Soviets were pretty... Like, for as much as the Mujahideen did a lot of terrible things, the Soviets did do a lot of brutal things to the Afghan population at the time. And of course, the Chechens. I mean, they did bomb Grozny into the smithereens. But, you know, the protocol is interesting for three reasons: what it purports to do, what it actually does, and for the admittedly slick way in which it tries to do so. The slickness is the way the protocol is structured. It begins with a pious preamble, typical enough that isn't that slick part. What is clever is that it repeats much of what we already have in Geneva Convention, Geneva, is that 5? Which is concerned with the protection of civilians caught up in war, as its protocol, and then intertwine some very new things. The new things include major advantages given gratis, or given license, to guerrillas and especially communist guerrillas, a broad ban on the use of what is called mercenaries, one rather unreasonable restriction on the use of food as a weapon, and a subtle way of saying it's okay to push the so now he's boomer posting about the nation of the Middle East and the sea. Then when a nation refuses to ratify the additional protocol for any of at least the 5 really good reasons not to do so, it stands accused of anything from being a favor of mass RPing to forced medical experimentation a la Mengele. Never mind that all of this is prohibited by the original Geneva Convention and that the additional protocol adds nothing of importance. You refuse to ratify the additional protocols, you Austrian painter bastard. Are these guys slick or what? As to what the protocol is supposed to do, protect civilians, one has to wonder. Is it part of the traditional law of war that in case of a siege, a city may have its food cut, and the civilians' attempt to escape may be fired upon, even redacted, to drive them back to eat up the food? This is cruel to be sure, an extreme measure, as the U.S. Army manual on the subject admitted. Well, I mean, they did do that in Fallujah, but well, you know. Cruel or not, this was upheld in the late 40s in the case of United States versus Ritter von Lieb, and is still up in the point good law outside of Transidom. Geneva Convention 5 ameliorated this harsh rule, and reasonably so, by requiring that some evacuations for particular reasons, maternity, infancy, infirmity, for example, be allowed. The protocol, however, does not allow food to be cut off or civilians to be driven back into besieged towns to eat up whatever food is there. Naturally, one cannot permit food to enter without at the same time feeding the garrison, which will ensure for itself that it eats first. Therefore, the besieger has a choice: sit there forever, which is generally impractical, or take the place by assault. Now imagine what will happen to the civilians if the town is stormed, when every room receives its donation of grenade and bullet, and this supposed to protect them. Starvation at least will unpleasant offers a good chance for a besieged town to fall after a few lean days without the massacre intended on assault. So wow, that's actually funny how something that's meant to, I mean, it's kind of ghastly logic, of course, But something meant to protect civilians actually harms them in the long run. Because if you know that you can't win, that an army that is more powerful than you is besieging you, that maybe if you surrender, then, well, you know. Then he says there's no legal principle, a Latin expression, expresso unus exclusio alteris est. The inclusion of one is the exclusion of the other. While the law of war does not mention illegal combatants, it goes on to some length to explain what is required to be a legal combatant. If there is such a concept as legal combatancy and rules which must be followed to attain the stature, then failure to follow these rules places one in the implicit state of illegal combat. Those rules are four. To be legal combatant under the original Geneva Convention, which is quite different from the additional protocol, to which the United States is not a party. One must A, wear a fixed insignia recognizable at a distance, and B, carry arms openly, and C, be under the command of a person or chain of command responsible for your actions, much like a privateer war was under a sovereign, and a pirate again was not. And D, conduct operations in accordance with the custom laws of war. Failure to meet any of these conditions makes one an illegal combatant. So then they say the individuals do not conduct operations. Organizations conduct operations. This implies that one is responsible for the actions of one's organization as well as for others. Can you hear the sound of Tronzi's head exploding over the last one? They might seem to have a point. Civil law normally does permit people to be held responsible for the actions of others, right? Wrong. Look up conspiracy. Once someone becomes part of a conspiracy, they become responsible for everything their conspirators do. Moreover, within the law of war's concept of reprisal, perfect innocents may be effectively responsible for what their side does. After all, what happens when a side violates the law by using a hospital safe for ammunition dump? The perfectly innocent and otherwise protected wounded are blasted from this world to the next in reprisals. It works the other way around. Note that General Yamashita was hanged not for anything he ordered or could have prevented, but for things sub-elements only notionally under his command did, even though he wasn't aware of them. What does this mean for the current war? It means that every Saudi kid inspired to go to Iraq to fight by watching some truck driver's head sawed off at an Al Jazeera has, in civilian terms, voluntarily joined a conspiracy to fight illegally and thus illegal combatant. That, in the law of war terms, he is an illegal combatant even if he personally follows the rules completely. Those who would grant him legal combat status, the Tronzis in other words, thus are trying to improve and enhance the effectiveness of those who would do and violate the law of war. This is something you would expect from the enemy, right? So what could we do? What would John and Tom like to see? Then he says, number one, never forget that the Tronzi purpose is inimical to ours. Inimical to ours. That they are the enemy as much as the Austrian painter was, or Al-Qaeda. They want us as a distinct nation and a distinct people to cease to exist. They want our constitution overthrown or made subordinate to their law, which amounts to the same thing. They want our military made subordinate to their judges so that can be undermined and made unable or unwilling to defend us. They want us to lose our wars. Number two, remembering that the Tronzis are the enemy, give them no aid, no money, no support, audit their books. They're corrupt as imaginable and cannot well stand auditing. They tend to lie, especially to raise money, require that their charitable activities advertise truthfully, and punish them when they do not. Jail a few of them. On second thought, jail a lot of them. Remove their tax-exempt status on first whiff of impropriety. When the ultimate Tronzi organization, the UN, cheats the Iraqi people and hides the details of the theft, withhold the funds otherwise due to the UN, and pay it to the Iraqis instead. With no chance of ever making good to the UN as any such amounts withheld and given. Number three, do you know that the United States has what amounts to a conditional declaration of war in place should anyone have the gall to grab one of our soldiers and turn them over to the ICC or some other Tronzi court? It's called the American Service Members Protection Act, and it passed unanimously in the Senate. Number four, even when we have them on the ropes, do not let up. Finish them off. Make the Tronzi organizations extinct and the parasites who live off of them spend the remainder of their day poor and hungry. And number five, don't give up hope. The Tronzis are not going to win. Their center of gravity, Europe, is dying to demographics. Within the United States and with our own Tronzi, much the same thing is happening regionally and subculturally. The prize Tronzi project, the UN and EU, are staggering under a burden of incompetence, ineffectuality, and corruption. Moreover, say what you will about Muslim extremists, they're still damn good at demonstrating to the world outside of Europe what happens when you let the Tronzis take over. And And that's the end of the essay. So, I mean, there's a number of problems, of course. I don't agree with the last part. I mean, as we see now, the United States has clearly subjugated Europe as a vassal state as a whole. And this has been a systematic project, I would say, since the end of the Second World War period. But, you know, I understand, like, that's an American boomer conservative patriotism thing of, like, you know, the Europeans, that they're the ones that are going to bring this about. And even Alex Jones indulged in a lot of this as well. But I think even though I don't agree with that point, I think there's a number of very interesting psychological implications. So let me go to the war thing first before I critique that last part. So that was a point that was pretty common around the beginning of the Afghanistan and then later the Iraq War. That was pretty common among American conservatives that were still in those days pro-war until people like Raimondo came about and really did a huge part in turning the right wing into a tactically anti-war position. Although you can say that on a more esoteric or metaphysical level, that the idea of war and being a warrior and so forth, that has always been integral to a sort of traditionalist or right-wing thought. But at the time, there was a lot of fear among conservatives and people that were more of this inclination that there were going to be unelected and ungovernable transnational bodies that were going to restrict that, at that time, which was still salient, that picture of America being this shining hill in the rock, being an exceptional nation that is carrying the torch of Western civilization against Muslims and so forth. But I think, so, and, you know, you have to be skeptical. And so one thing I would caution is that you have to be skeptical of the nature of the term transnational progressive, because there are people that then later became like ardent neocons or so forth. Like, and like the term actually originated with people like John Bolton in the American Enterprise Institute, to which Fonte was a part. But then he later, you know, drifted into territory that we all know today as basic normie right-wing talking points, especially on whatever you want to call it, the dissident right, the E-right, or rather that subcutaneous layer that just reaches above the dissident sphere. I'm thinking of people like Orrin McIntyre or Jack Posobiec or Tucker Carlson. And, you know, John Fonte was a part of the Hudson Institute, and it did come from, you know, foreign policy research and so forth. And they really took inspiration from Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. Quote, on the one hand, those who adopt a collectivist continental European approach, on the other hand, an entrepreneurial, liberal, Anglo-American style regime. So this is the divide. And there was, in the conspiracy movement back in the day, I'm old enough to remember that time. There was that notion, okay, so the first criticism would be that, you know, it would basically be holding America back from reprisals for 9/11 and so forth. And that a lot of veterans who were involved in like conservative or right-wing politics felt that these unelected bodies would then impinge upon American freedom and ability to conduct war. Then later the right wing switched to more of an anti-war position that was solidified, especially in the Obama years. Even like John Bolton used the term global. I mean, he himself is a globalist, right? And especially after having Trump derangement syndrome after Trump booted him. But like, it's so funny that John Bolton, which he was cautioned by his fellow Americanists against the rise of the globalists, whom he described as law and international relations professors and other academics, media professionals, humanitarian, environmental groups. But he himself is a globalist, and he himself is a huge That Nation in the Middle East stan, who was basically, when they were doing, was it during the Intifada? Where he was like basically the fourth lobbyist for the four from That Nation in the Middle East. And in September 2016, John Yoo and Fonte said that democratic internationalism is outlined in the November 2012 Council on Foreign Relations Working Paper, accurately described what Yoo and Fonte called the Transnational Progressivist Agenda. 2018 CRB article, Fonte said the Council on Foreign Relations was central command for liberal internationalism. So where do you think, then of course, oh, wow, there you go. Even John G. Eikenberry who himself is like, did he write Liberal Leviathan? What was his, yes, he wrote Liberal. I had to actually read that in international relations. I hated that book. That book is like total, like turbo American empirism. And of course, he is a professor of Georgetown, Princeton University, University of Pennsylvania. And he is, you would describe him as like an American globalist, said that democratic internationalism was a better strategy in 2012. And American exceptionalism and democratic internationalism, quote, builds on, exploits the opportunities of a heavily democratic world. And yeah, he's like totally, like you would describe him as a globalist. Like he's like sort of, global Hamiltonian. Although I do think the distinction between Jeffersonian and Hamiltonianism is more complicated, and that to say that like Hamilton was on the political left, that was, that's like a misjudging of what a true left and right is. That was purposely obscured by the American political spectrum. He wrote this in New Criterion article entitled Gulliver's Travels. John O'Sullivan used the metaphor of the United States as a fictional Gulliver and Jonathan Swift's satire. Gulliver was tied down in a web woven by much smaller Lilliputians whose collaborative effort to subdue the giant Gulliver ultimately failed. So, when you hear Alex Jones, for example, talk about the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, this was work I think that he was reading back in the early 2000s, post the first invasion of Afghanistan in Tora Bora, and then of course in 2003 with the invasion of Baghdad, the bombing of Baghdad in the invasion of Iraq. And so you have another one saying that warned that transnational progressives go well beyond traditional commitments to federalism and separation of powers with the nation by endorsing post-national citizenship. And a lot of these bodies that sponsor governments, or rather sponsor government, various people in government. So, where do you think these ideas come from? Do you think that Justin Trudeau came up with post-national country on his own? Right? No, this has all been cooked up in a lot of different think tanks and NGOs and policy papers and so forth. And so the one criticism I have is that during this time, you have to realize the context of it is that, unfortunately, a lot of the stuff, and I know certain people online talk about this, but then again, a lot of people online, not a lot, but there's a few people that I'm not going to name names that use it to, more or less go after Trump and so forth, or to sort of throw out black pills here and there. But you have to be cautious of these terms, because the term transnational progressivism was used by people like John Bolton. Now, I believe that you could wrestle it from these people, but given the context of post 9/11, the invasion of Afghanistan, then in 2003 with the bombing of Iraq, then the invasion of Iraq, and then, of course, festering into long, brutal 20-year wars that were supposedly for quote-unquote humanitarian ends, or rather it became not a clash of civilizations. But then when you get to Obama, and Max Blumenthal, by the way, is very good at covering this in his book, Management of Savageries, that you have the switch to humanitarian transnational progressive war. And of course, but then the earlier iteration by people like Fonte and people like Kratman are saying that they're sort of tying a hand on the back of America. And that, as we know, was a discourse that then later faded away when the right wing in North America and in Europe became more anti-interventionist, which leads me to the second point. And Alex Jones used to do this all the time with his sort of like implicit and sometimes explicit American jingoism that I think is not to say that, Americans don't deserve a status of uniqueness, of course. I love America, and I love the idea of America and so forth, and the American people. But, especially being a Leaf, you always look towards America as quote unquote more based than Canada. But I think the problem is that there's a warranted criticism of that when it comes to relations with not necessarily the bureaucracy, the EU, the globalist arm of European governments, but rather the European people and the extension of Europe in North America. And I know that the sort of mythos of America being the rebellion against King George and so forth, and being a new nation that was an explicit rejection of the old world. But I think that times have changed, and there has to be a sort of recognition of a kinship between Europe and North America. And that case is way easier to make, or at least it was, up until, Trudeau Sr., with Canada. Canada being explicit outgrowth of a unique fusion of European nations. And I will have a Canadian on eventually on Content Minded to discuss the potentialities of a different iteration, or rather what was an older iteration of Canadian politics and culture. But that being said, I think that the antagonism towards Europe, which is at the end of this essay with Kratman and Ringo, that the Europeans are this unique threat to American sovereignty, and the Europeans, they were always more progressive, they were always more globalist, they were always more quote unquote collectivist, is a very sort of like old school American yeoman libertarian Jeffersonian thesis, right? And so I think that the politics of nowadays reveals a criticism in that the Europeans are in a much weaker position and have been more or less, especially in recent years with the Ukraine war, are in a position of subjugation to the elite class of America. And I think that even Alex Jones back in the days, like, they're gonna, the UN blue hats, they're gonna form a coalition of European nations and Canadians and China, and they're gonna, weaken America, and then they're gonna invade America, or they're gonna create a crisis where they're gonna invade America, and they're gonna subjugate the American military. And so there very much is this lingering paranoia over the transnational bodies of Europe interfering in American affairs, which at the time you could say was warranted. But I think political realities on the ground, geopolitical realities on the ground currently complicate this thesis. And furthermore, it just tends to be a sort of pop culture refuse. And I think a lot of people, even the political right, who are in America, don't understand that. Or they do, but that's sort of like, I understand, like, by them, the picture of Europe being like more cosmopolitan and left-wing is an extension of, it's a weird extension of the older attitude of America being a newer world, being the new world, and America being over that of the old world. And it's a very interesting dynamic, how even in the political right, you do have this like, and Alex Jones, I remember for years would talk about this. He was even in his documentary, I believe it came out in 2010, 2011, Endgame, where it was like, the EU commissioners, that they're eroding American sovereignty. And it was a very like hair-raising, hairpin trigger threat of these unelected bureaucrats in Europe trying to dictate to America what they can and can't do, which I understand, of course. But nowadays, imagine if you're a European and Washington is telling you that all of your defense spending has to go towards the war in Ukraine, and that you have to basically be a vassal state. And then you have some bug man tells you in that one viral video recently that you have to be a tourist trap and you should be thankful for it, and that your history doesn't matter. And I'm not going to get into the particularities of that particular so-called comedian, but for YouTube purposes. But I do find it very interesting, that dynamic, and I think that dynamic is sort of, thankfully, it's still there though, but hopefully it erodes over time. The whole like, especially within a right-wing context, the whole America versus Europe dynamic isn't a good one. Because I think I was actually talking about this with my woman being Irish, and I mentioned I was doing this episode about transnational progressivism. She said, yeah, she's Irish, so she said, yeah, this is exactly the situation in Ireland. And that a lot of people, for example, they say that the migrant centers, they have to like use their their tax money for it, and so forth, and that is true. But I think what a lot of Irish people don't realize, or most Irish people don't realize that are against it, is that it even goes beyond just sucking dry those host nations in Europe, the transnational progressivist agenda, because they're very willing to foot the bill on an EU level, or even using American taxpayer money to prop up these migrant centers, to import effectively the dissolution of the Irish people and the British people and the French and the Germans and the Ukrainians and everybody. And so they're more than willing to foot that bill. The same way that they are willing to, of course, spend billions upon billions of American taxpayer money for the war in Ukraine. And it's it's very interesting how these dynamics now play out when it comes to that sort of older American libertarian conspiracy theorist type of stuff when it comes to these huge bodies of centralization in Europe. And Europe is overtly more centralized and so forth. But I would say that the same particular ideological strains are also there in America. It's just that America gets pegged as being more libertarian and more decentralized. In some ways it is, of course. But there still is that Hamiltonian strain in America. And, me being a libertarian at the time as well, I mean, I've long since grown out of it. I think that sort of thinking is quite reductionistic, and that there's more to it than just big government versus little government or non-intervention or whatever. Of course, there is a lot of government bloat, and no people should be dictated to by an unelected body, even a regional power. And see, this is the problem, I think, with a lot of American libertarian conspiracy theory thinking as well. And I know I'm defending, but when I read the Fonte essay, I'm going to defend the term transnational progressive more, and hence why I use the term. But I do think that and it is ingrained in the American psyche. And I'm saying this as someone from a country that at least used to be part of the Commonwealth, or part of a greater tie towards Europe than America, which its identity rebelled against the British and those European powers, the old world, you could say, as a whole. So, I mean, if you're an American listening, and most of my audience is American, then it is, ingrained within the psyche of America to rebel against the old world. And so this makes things difficult, because I think that there is a marked difference between the ancient regime, between Christendom, between that side of things, and what you would say as the modern notion of regional powers. Because it's not that they're good or bad. I mean, a lot of them can be bad as well. A lot of them can be quite good. A lot of kingdoms can be quite good. A lot of empires can be quite good. But it's more of just the fact, and this is like the Mershheimerian... is that how you say it? The Mershheimerian analysis, that there will always be regional power blocks that exist. And a lot of people will have to take orders from people that have subjugated them. But there is a form of a noblesse oblige when it comes to a subjugated people. Whereas with transnational progressivism, there is no such thing. There is the erosion of your identity and who you are, and even who you are on a material level in terms of demographics. So that is the key difference. You have many empires and many kingdoms that were more or less metastable and had a form of stability. So I think that transnational progressivism came about at a time when you had these ideological debates and you had a much different framing, and it was easier to convince people on the political right that, yes, these unelected bureaucrats in Europe, they want to control your sovereignty. But now that Washington basically controls the sovereignty of Europe as a whole, with the exception of maybe a few places in Eastern Europe. One huge place in Eastern Europe, if you know what I mean. No, I'm not trying to Vatnik post, but you know what I mean. So, but also, before we get to reading the Fonte essay, there's a number of online stuff that I managed to find going outside of Google. I believe I went on DuckDuckGo, and like the degradation of Google is incredible. You can't find anything. And so I recently found, and I believe he was quite popular back in the day. Back in the, like, I wouldn't say NRX, but like sort of the social conservative, or, you know, more like right-wing social conservative blogger sphere along with NRX. But do you guys remember Spartacus? Spartacus blogs? A curmudgeon's thoughts on politics, international affairs, and journalism. I believe he stopped in 2020. What's his latest one? 2022? Yeah, April 2022. I believe was his last blog post. And that was a jump from February 2018. So this is like ancient. This is like the old Giga Chad. You know, I love that meme, the ancient Giga Chad. Like you're an old head Giga Chad if you remember this particular thing. But this comes from December 17th, 2002. I remember I think I was like just out of school. And I was excited because it was almost my birthday. And how old was I? I was in grade 4 when 9/11 happened. I was 8 years old when my grandfather passed away. I would have been like 9 or 10 in 2002. So this is ancient head lore, but it managed to preserve. I don't believe I went to the Stephen Dembeste website. I couldn't link to any articles. I mean, the articles are there, but I have to use Translate. So this links to a quote from a blog post by Stephen Dembeste on Transnational Progressivism. So this is simply titled Transnational Progressivism by Spartacus. John Fontes recently wrote a very interesting, fairly brief article on the rise of transnational progressivism. Longer version with footnotes here. I'd never heard of the term before, but like most brilliant ideas, it seems obvious once it is explained. Stephen Dembeste summarized Fontes' view on transnational progressivism thusly. A completely, quote, and so this is a long quote, a completely new international political movement has formed, which opposes liberal democracy as we know it, or as we in the U.S. practice it. He refers to, so again, they still have like the boomer conservative attachment to democracy. He refers to it as a transnational progressivism and makes a persuasive case that it's the underlying philosophy behind such apparently disparate phenomena as the anti-globalist movement, the sustainable development movement, those who support the International Criminal Court, much of the forces supporting multiculturalism in the liberal academia, and the apparent hypocrisy of international human rights organizations who are eager to condemn the U.S. while ignoring much worse abuses by third world nations, and the formation of the European Union and the structure of the European Commission in Brussels. It ties in the clear elite elements that all of these demonstrate, and the way that all of them are fundamentally undemocratic and demonstrably contemptuous of the opinions of the common man. It also ties in with the entire idea that nations should have high taxes, central control, and heavy social spending. These things don't seem to be related, but they all express the same fundamental political philosophy. Whether or not you support transnational progressivism, in this case you're wondering I don't, this is an interesting synthesis of several seemingly unrelated international trends. I urge you to take a look for yourself. Like many things in the blogosphere, the term transnational progressivism has taken on a life of its own, and the noun form has been shortened to Tronzy, as in Dembeste's description of the Boston Review's New Democracy Forum as the nexus, the center of the Tronzy Brain Trust. And when you click on the link, I don't know if the link is still there, but is there nothing new under the sun? This was from 2002. The blog sphere was going crazy over it, but now you can barely find any resources on it. Isn't that crazy? Is there nothing new under the sun? We are still talking about it. And the reason I bring it up is because the term transnational progressivism does have a lot of the elements of what we mean by the regime, or what people like Moldbug can and he probably was exposed to this as well. They come up with these flowery definitions of, the cathedral, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, of course, there's other words I can't use on YouTube, but it seems that, despite us hating on the boomers, and the boomers are worthy of hatred, of course, in a lot of ways, but despite hating on the boomer conservatives, a lot of these issues are basically the core foundational idea space of a lot of right-wing thought, particularly in North America. And this is why you have to go back to when the early blogosphere, the E-right, was being formed. And you have to look at this. And people like Stephen Dembeste, God rest his soul, was trailblazing in this regard. And so it boggles my mind, because I remember, as an old head, in Samizdat, it links to this Samizdat article that no longer exists, a blog for people with critical, rational, individualist perspective, and I wonder when they were last updated. This is like old school blogosphere stuff. This is like people had their individual websites, and that's recently updated, July 25th, 2024. A quote of the day: lower productivity of the government's objective. So yeah, it's still up and going. I mean, there's still, it's incredible how there are these ancient heads that are still posting on blogs. It's absolutely incredible. But this is the history that you have to learn. If you are a mind chud, if you are a sensitive young man, if you are a sensitive young frog, this is the history that you have to learn. And there's other links, and this is another thing I wanted to get to before I get to the John Fonte article. This is by a professor, and where is it? Oh, there's one from The Atlantic from 2008. 2 cheers for Transy. Wow. Incredible. But this is about George W. Bush. And so again, another link I found, no thanks to Google. I mean, Google's just totally broken at this point. But this is from Opinio Juris. This is from 30th 10, 2007. Okay, wow. Okay, so this was, I believe, right around the time of Fallujah, or the uptick in Iraq. This is by Peter Spiro. Is a Charles Werner Professor of Law at Temple University. He's author of At Home in Two Countries, The Past and Future of Dual Citizenship. So this is called George W. Bush, Transnational Progressive. And it's just a short one, but it really does illustrate, I think, the mood at the time. First, there's this screed in Human Events, now this editorial, from more mainstream conservative mouthpiece National Review, accusing Bush of being in the thralls of transnational progressivism, TRONSI for short, coming out against ratification of the law of the Sea Treaty. National Review asks why the administration's support for it. So, yeah, this is that's actually insane that this comes from National Review at the time. Because we all know how National Review is nowadays, the odious mix of barely conservative, neocon, anti-Trump, anyways. While it seems to be a part of a pattern, that pattern includes also the astonishing decision of the Bush White House to seek the overriding of Texas law on the death penalty in deference to the World Court. What we are seeing is an outbreak of Transism, the administration, cowed by accusations of earlier unilateralism. That administration now bends over backwards to placate the international community. Very interesting. That the National Review, who by the way is going along nowadays with the international community over the Ukraine war, for instance. The permanent bureaucracy at the UN State Department has long been in the grips of this tendency. Since the departure of John Bolton, our diplomatic officialdom seems to have been kept a pliant administration, including both President and Secretary of State, under its sway. As a result, we may soon be relying on the UN bureaucracy to maintain the freedom of the seas essential to our trade, commerce, and military alliance. So again, sea law and the U.S. supremacy over the seas is an issue that is still relevant to this day when it comes to China, when it comes to the Houthis, and so forth. We'd have thunk that George W. Bush would end up being the bedfellow of the internationalists. Who would have thunk it? I doubt he self-identified that way. So what really explains the administration's submission? It must have been some muscle behind it to have prevailed with these folks. Meanwhile, will Tronzy, quote unquote, emerge as a post-globalization's equivalent of commie with the red meat crowd? Somehow I just don't see it catching on beyond the confines of Free Republic. Meanwhile, it looks as if the ever bitter enders are jumping ship. Who will be left to come? So this is from 2007. And of course, Peter Spyro. Past the future of dual citizenship. Interesting. But, he is essentially a neocon, if I recall. And he, American legal scholar. He worked in Toronto. And American legal scholar whose specialties include law and U.S. constitutional law, leading expert on dual citizenship. From the Rusk Professor of National Law at University of Georgia since 2006, has been the Charles W. Werner Professor of Law at Temple University. And his work Beyond Citizenship, American Identity After Globalization's Beyond Citizenship, the impact of dual citizenship, naturalization, diaspora, identifying the citizenship of the United States, criticized traditional methods of ascribing nationality, jus soli, jus sanguinis. Is that? Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's blood and soil, isn't it? So, nationality is determined required by the nationality of one's or both parents. Well, basically kind of blood and soil. And so he's like a lib and also a neocon. So, of course, he's criticizing at that time, which is actually crazy. That was the opinion of the National Review at the time. And wow, that's incredible. So it's funny that Tronzy didn't really catch on, Transnational Progressivism, but I do think that it should catch on. And when we read this Fonte essay, we will see. But it is quite insane how things have developed to where now John Bolton and the National Review are both part of Transnational Progressivism. So let's now move on to the John Fonte essay. Thank you for listening to the Content Minded podcast. If you wish to support me and listen to every episode in full, then please go to patreon.com/giantartproductions and substack.com/Gio's Content Corner. There you will find the full archive of every Content Minded episode, as well as every Giant Art Review episode, and exclusive to all patrons, the weekly Cole Report, where I break down interesting stories and discourse from throughout the week. Subscribe today to keep the content renaissance alive.